Well, hi, my name is Dennis Duma. I'm an associate professor here in the UGA Department of Ed Psych. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Sheila Pontis, who is a senior lecturer at the Massachusetts Institute for Technology, where she is the lead curriculum designer for the Integrated Design plus Management Master's Program. She's the author of 3 books about information design and teaches a course designed to develop the creativity of early career scientists. I'm sure some of the lessons learned from that course will be incorporated into her talk today, which is entitled Daydream, Imagine, Play, helping students reconnect with their superpowers. We have 1 hour scheduled for this session, but the talk will be less than 1 hour with time for questions left over. After the formal part of the talk is over, please place your questions in the chat box and I'll read them to the group and to Sheila, or use the raise hand function and I'll call on you and you can ask your question directly to Sheila. Thanks very much. Sheila, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dennis, for the introduction. And thank you so much to the organizers of the festival for the invitation to be here today. I'm trying to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay. Can you see everything okay?
Yes.
Good. Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy here to be sharing part of my work on creativity education, and specifically my experience working with college students and how that could inform creativity education in the future. So me particularly today, I'm going to be talking about teaching creativity to, so I am, as Danny was saying, I'm an information designer by training. So I've been for probably more than 20 years working with creativity as part of my practice, as part of the way I see the world. As designers and artists, we learn creativity from an early age, and everything we do is has creativity intrinsic to the way we work. However, people who are not related to design or to art, probably they encounter creativity from a different perspective. So before joining Princeton in 2016, all my experience in higher education had been teaching design, research, or information design and problem solving to or within a design education context. So when I joined Princeton specifically to teach this course, Creativity, Innovation, and Design, I encountered a very different type of students. As you probably know, there's no design major at Princeton, and all the students are probably interested in different type of careers, from computer science, mechanical engineering, psychology, philosophy, dance, anything you want but design. So teaching this class was really, to me, an eye-opening experience, because it really confronted me to teaching creativity in an explicit way to people who have never encountered this way of thinking, probably in their education after primary school. So in this class, we exposed the students from very different types of exercises. They were exposed to open-ended, ambiguous prompts. There were no tests for the students, and there was no usually a right answer for the questions we given them to respond. And to an extent, this type of learning, teaching and learning, was very different from the students from other classes at Princeton, where they always praised for having the right answer and thinking fast about something and kind of pursuing, trying to understand what the teacher was looking after. So in this class, the students were learning creativity in an explicit way from a different perspective. And this was a 12-week course where the first 3 weeks was more about teaching creativity skills, and the last part of the semester, so more like 7-8 weeks, was focused on design thinking. And in this class, the students were working in teams to develop solutions for a given social challenge. Of course, as you can see here, some of these challenges are very broad and complex and wicked, so we were not expecting them to solve them completely, but to suggest something from a creative perspective that could mitigate some of these challenges. So they apply some of the creativity techniques they learned early on in the course to this specific social challenge. And then they were presenting the final solution to a panel of experts, which were evaluating the relevance of the solution they created. So after teaching this class to around 150 students throughout 7 semesters and sometimes 2 or 3 sessions per semester, I've learned a lot of things about the students, and specifically, I identify sets of internal and external factors that were impeding students' development, and also they were related to how they were engaging with the different types of exercises we were exposing students. So to an extent, there were 3 types of students. There were a group of students who elected to be in the class, who were exposed to this different way of teaching, and they were embracing the exercises. They loved being challenged, they loved not knowing what to do, and they were happy to discover different ways of looking at the world. There was a second group of students that were a little bit more skeptical. They were looking at me like, why are we doing this? What's the point of playing with Legos, playing with clay? But they decided to go along. And there was a third group of students who actually questioned everything we were proposing them to do, from what's the scientific value of this, what was the practical value. And to an extent, these students feel extremely uncomfortable with the exercises, to the point that some of them did drop even 6-7 weeks into the class. And to an extent, what I started to realize is that some of these attitudes were related to a misconception they had about creativity. On the one hand, most of the students were associating creativity with art and design. To be creative, you need to be an artist. To be creative, you need to be a writer or a designer. And if you were not that, what was the point of creating? But on the other hand, they also were associating creativity to an extent with innovation, with the type of creativity that we associate with the geniuses, the Steve Jobs, the Picassos, the Einsteins, the Marie Curies in the world. And they were thinking that to be creative, you had to create something that changed the world, that have a change in paradigm in society. However, at the beginning, we were trying to expose students to what is called, taken after Teresa Amabile, this everyday creativity. So the little things that we do, everyday life, to deal with different situations we encounter, and how we approach every situation, every scenario, every problem from a different point of view, and we generate something that is creative for us to come up with a solution in the moment. So having this distinction in mind was important at the beginning for them to understand where they were going. At the same time, because of this misconception, whether they were understanding some of the tools, that they were applying the tools from brainstorming to divergent thinking to, I don't know, different types of visual thinking tools, they were applying the tools, but to an extent they really didn't understand. They didn't have enough time to internalize the concepts and to really understand where they were using those tools, or what was the benefit of using those tools in the specific moments they were using them. And part of that was because of their own self-imposed constraints about what they had to do. They assumed that some things were expected from them to do that were to an extent hindering their imagination and hindering the type of ideas they were generating. It was really hard for them to break with the practicality of the ideas they had to come up with, what the right answer they were trying to look for. And to an extent, this was fed by the college culture. Remember that Princeton is an Ivy League school where they are praised for critical thinking. They are rewarded for having the right answer at the right moment and as fast as they can. So all these internal and external factors, to an extent, were creating the students, or were resulting in the students not really embracing a change in their mindset. The class, that type of class where the component about intrinsic creativity was so short, was not enough for the students to change the mindset. And after the class ended, or even in other classes, they had the same attitude. They really didn't manage to connect with a different way of thinking the world, a more creative way of thinking. So this made me think about how might we help the students to develop a creative mindset. And with this, I mean, how can we help the students, college students in particularly, really go back to the early age where they have this curiosity for learning, this curiosity about the world, where they wanted to play in order to learn, to discover new things, and where they could make anything out of anything. So with this idea in mind, I decided to create a freshman seminar, which was called Reimagining Your World, Creativity Scholarship, Skills and Practical Applications. And my idea was for this freshman seminar to be taught in the fall. So as soon as the students enter into college, they had the possibility to choose this elective seminar to an extent to avoid the impact that sometimes higher education could have in students' creativity. And rather than focusing creativity to help others, to come up with a solution for a societal problem, I focus on creativity to help them as human beings. That's why it's creativity for well-being. These courses, specifically seminars, are capped at 15 students, and they are elective. And luckily, we were oversubscribed, so we have 44 students interested in the class, which gave me the possibility to really choose 15 students which were very diverse from each other and have very different interests. So they could actually complement each other's views. And the goal of the class was specifically to understand what creativity is. So we had the same baseline and everyone knew what we were talking about when we talked about creativity, how to apply it in everyday life to increase self-worth, design their lives, and approach problems from different perspectives. And to do that, the class focused on 2 specific goals. So individual creativity, or little c. So it was trying to help the students from the inside out, first them to reconnect with their own creativity. And then we had time to apply that to make some societal changes. And on the other hand, we also work with the concept of deliberate cognitive creativity, which I call it, to an extent, the ability to use creative skills on demand, so when we need it, and to really understanding the different cognitive mechanisms that can hinder or enhance imagination and associative thinking. So by understanding all these different mechanisms, the students will be better equipped to not only understanding the tools and the skills, but also to apply them where they need them, because they knew when that would be, and also to identify which were their internal blocks that were not allowing them to generate the type of ideas they needed, and how to work around those blocks. To achieve these 2 goals, I developed this little pedagogical model based on 3 pillars. I call them science, practice, and reflection. And to an extent, when science, I meant like, my approach to creativity, as I am not a psychologist and I'm not a cognitive neuroscientist by training, I learned a lot by reading and understanding and getting familiar with the different approaches and studies that have been done from different disciplines about creativity, from psychology, organizational theory, cognitive neuroscience. So I gave that same body of literature to the students so they could get exposed to different types of studies that they will realize on creativity, and they would start having a sense of how complex this domain is, or how rich, and that creativity is not only one thing, but actually could be learned and could be mastered to an extent. So they saw that there are different dimensions, that there are different levels that you can approach creativity. There are cognitive components that have an impact on creativity. There are personal components like their attitude, their motivation, mental blocks, and there are also environmental components. And then they understood where this class would focus on and how we were going to approach little c creativity. We also have content experts coming into the class to talk about topics I didn't know as much, to help them also with more psychological issues they were experiencing. And it was a lot of discussion-led type of interactions. To me, creativity is like a muscle where you have to practice it as much as you can in order to get better at that. So every single class, we were practicing the different concepts and skills about creativity that we were learning, either with warm-up exercises, individual or group activities, and they were more like long-term projects. And for that, having the right space where to teach this class was essential. So most of the spaces or the classrooms at Princeton have this traditional layout where the furniture is fixed, where there's an implicit power dynamic between teachers and students, and this is really strong at Princeton. So this type of classroom was not going to help teach this type of class. So luckily, we have this more interactive classroom where all the furniture can be moved around. You can set up the classroom in whatever way you want. So this class allowed me to change the layout based on the activity we were going to cover every week. So the students really didn't know what they were going to see when they walk into the class. And also it broke with that power dynamic because we were always sitting in a circle and I was sitting with them for the whole class. Also, as you can see, there's no technology. So I never was teaching with a computer or with a deck, but actually I was drawing on the whiteboards or creating flip chart paper, like lists of concepts that we were actually building together based on readings they have done and questions they have with the class. This also helped the students be less on their phones and more focused on what each other person was saying and the experience of the other students. We also have a virtual classroom to an extent. This was a private Instagram account where the students can share their experiences with the class exercises and projects throughout the week, and they can support each other if they were struggling with something they were experiencing. But the most important pillar to me from this seminar was the reflective aspect. So as we saw before, lack of motivation is something that can really hinder creative thinking. So understanding where the lack of motivation was coming and helping the students identify their own fears and mental blocks and why they were feeling sometimes they were feeling so uncomfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty, and this type of creative thinking was really important for me to help the students embrace their creativity. So as much as we could, we practiced meditation in class, we went out to the park to do that, we work on different types of exercises, and specifically I designed a set of exercises that I call them think up activities, which actually they were inspired by Lois Santos' class at Yale about happiness. So I created something that every week the students were going to explicitly practice as homework one creativity skill. So one week they focus specifically on daydreaming for 3 days, another day on building empathy, another day on analogizing, another week. So the interesting thing of these exercises is like they have two parts. One was the task where they will require to document the way in which they will complete in the task, either by taking photos, sketching, writing, drawing, whatever they wanted. And another part, they have to reflect on the experience of completing the task. And by doing that, they were starting to integrate the concepts they were seeing in class. And also they were able to start putting words into their own feelings and really identifying why some things were harder or easier for them to do. So each of the students bought a blank notebook, and they had to complete that as the course was going on. So here we have some examples of how each student was approaching the different think up activities. So here we can see like collage, visual elements, you have the dates, you have different reflections they were sharing. And then you have another exercise. This is a student that likes, is a slightly more visual, likes to draw a little more. And there was no right or wrong way of solving the task. As long as they sat down, they tried to do it and they tried to reflect, that was fine, and then share the experience. So for example, here we have one of the activities, which was called week 4, become your phone. And it says, this is a short part of the task, for at least 3 days, become your phone. Imagine what your phone is, sensing, what is sensing and feeling, how it sees the world and how a day looks like. Pretend that the phone's world is your world, its physical attributes yours. So we are going to see that how two students approach the same exercise in very different ways. So this student is extremely visual, and she decided to create like a comic strip where she was the phone, and she was trying to sense what the phone was sensing, what the phone was feeling, and so on. While another student took a very different approach, and she just preferred to write rather than to be so visual. And this was extremely challenging exercise for the student, from understanding the brief, what do you mean by becoming my phone, but the phone doesn't have feelings. So reconciling what the open-ended task was asking them to do, and then do this for 3 or 4 days. So to assess all these tasks and these activities, we were looking at 3 different components: the process, so the different weekly activities that the students were engaging, whether they were exploring and elaborating on their ideas, whether they were using creative strategies that we were covering in class or not. And then we were looking at the final deliverables, whether they were completing the specific requirements, whether they were submitting on time, and so on. And the last component was the project reflection. So why they decided to do that, how did they feel through the process, which assumptions they thought they were challenging, which personal barriers they identified. So it was not only based on the final product, but on the whole process from the beginning to the end. So let's see how some of these strategies play in practice. So the first part of the semester was focused on developing the creative mindset, and the last part was more on applying those learnings into their own lives. So for example, the very first week, I gave the students this warm-up activity. I gave each of these students one of these outlines, and I asked them to color this. I gave them color pencils and they have to color this. Just for context, remember this is Princeton, where there's a lot of emphasis on critical thinking, on saving the world, or really like important type of activities. And I started the class with this, which is something usually associated with children's activities. So this was the result from everyone in the class. And you can see that at a glance, the strawberries are red and the trees are green. So only a few of them kind of broke a little bit with the boundaries of the drawings and tried to do something slightly different. So this was a conversation starter, and to an extent to indicate that it would be ideal if by the end of the class, we could have 15, 16 very different approaches to the same exercise, and very different trees and very different strawberries. After this discussion and talking about the results, I asked the class, what did they think about the activity? And of course, the students, half of them looking at the floor, some of them looking at me puzzled, like, why are we doing this? And all of a sudden, one of them, a brave one, raised his hand and he says, well, this was a little childish. And that was great, because this was a really where I wanted the students to indicate what they really thought about the activity, how much what they were expecting a class to be was influencing, and how they were judging something based on social construct, what is expected to be learned at the Princeton class. So that was like a really good way to start framing the class, to start talking about mental blocks, and to start thinking about our own assumptions and how that shapes everything we see and how we approach things. We also work on more understanding personal barriers. This is an exercise where the students have to draw their own creative processes based on literature they have to read for the class, and then they have to match mental blocks also given from a list to the specific stages in the process that help them realize which stages were harder for them to accomplish than others. And to wrap up the first unit of the class, they work in a team project called Understanding Creativity, where they have to teach all the concepts about creativity that they have been learning in the class to 2 very different groups of students. So on the one hand, they were freshmen high school students, and on the other hand, they had to do a workshop for adults. And this exercise really forced them to internalize the concepts in such a way that they would be able to explain that to others. And they were going to be exposed to how they were reacting when I was teaching them creativity. And then as part of the exercise, after teaching those workshops, they have to reflect on the experience of teaching creativity to both groups, to the high schoolers and to the adults, and then comparing the same activities and the learnings they have. And to wrap up this first half of the semester, we did a very last envisioning in-class activity, where I asked them, so visualize a future for yourself in which everything has turned out the way you have wanted. And I emphasized anything, absolutely anything is possible. So it was right before they were going for fall break. So I asked them, how could this week turn out ideal for you? So I gave the students some time to think. They have paper, they drew something, and we were sitting in a circle. So then they started sharing their responses. One of them says, well, I getting all A's in my classes. Another one second that, yeah, I want to get all A plus in my classes. And I was asking them, is this your ideal week? Well, maybe you can get a job that pays like 6-digit salary. Another one wanted to become a successful entrepreneur. Another one working for Google, Apple, and so on. And I was like feeling like, how can it be after 6 weeks? And this is the ideal week. And more or less like up to like half the circle, one of the students raised his hand and she said, well, if I could do anything, it could be cool if tomorrow I wake up and campus is a huge playground. Buildings are made of chocolate, and each time we walk into one, we travel to different locations, and then we can meet people from other timelines. As she was sharing her idea of an ideal world week, all the other students started changing their faces immensely. They were like laughing and saying, wow, that's so cool. That's super fun. And the reaction from all of them was like, but that's not real. I didn't know we could do that. And it was really a turning point in the class where they were starting to realize that they were imposing their own self-imposed constraints into the exercises, and they were answering in the way that they thought it was expected for them to answer, rather than really allowing themselves to think about ideal as anything is possible. And I wanted to share with you something that one of the students wrote when he came. So while he was in the break, when he went home, and he wrote that in his journal, in his creativity journal. He says, since returning to my home, I have started to notice and wonder about things I hadn't noticed before. I think about local restaurants that I never went to, the smells and sights outside my house, and the sounds of my car as I'm driving. All these things seem to pop out to me now. I find almost a new world inside a world that I already thought I knew so well, my own home. Overall, I'm just genuinely surprised at how much more I'm able to think about and notice around me. It's like, it was super important for me to read this because it meant that the students were starting to notice different things. The class was starting to shape their patterns of thoughts, and they were starting to open up their eyes in a different way, noticing. That was, to me, a huge accomplishment with the class. And with that mindset, we approached the last part of the semester where they were applying the concepts to their own lives. And they engaged in a 6-week individual project where they were tasked with the activity of designing the next 3.5 years at Princeton. So the goal was to imagine, design, and prototype an ideal Princeton experience that would help them work towards their personal goals. So not what they was expected for them to do to become successful, whatever, unless that's something they really wanted to do. But I wanted to give them the chance for them to envision, to dream big, to try to reconnect with other dreams that they may have. So each of the following 6 weeks, they engage in different activities, first to envision and diverging possibilities in different types of potential journeys or potential futures. One was more academic, another one was more surreal, another one was more fun, whatever they want to call it. They also, while they were working individually, there was a lot of collaborative feedback during the class. They were sharing, they were gaining feedback from other students, they were challenged about their ideas, and they were also asked to prototype any aspect of that journey. Even if it was abstract, they had to find a way to create, to make it tangible, either physically or by expressing sounds or smells or body language in some form or another. We work a lot with analogizing to help the students that had like more abstract ideas or journeys, came up with a way to express that to others so others could understand, could empathize. They were creating each other's posters to promote the event. And a difference from the prior class I taught about creativity, where what happened in the class stayed in the class and was presented to a panel of experts, the students had to present their journeys to the whole university. So to an extent, we took over one of the buildings, the ground floors on the buildings in Central Campus, and we created a science fair type of exhibition where each student had a space and they could do whatever they wanted to communicate their journeys to whoever was walking by. So there were many different approaches to the exercise, from games to experiences, dancing salsa, to objects that were representing what they wanted for their future at Princeton, from breaking with bubbles, breaking with piñatas and creating a party. And that was kind of inviting also other people from the Princeton community to see what could be done, to see their dreams. That was a huge kind of challenge for the students, not to stay in their own words, but actually to share this with someone else. So there are many other things I could share, but I'm just wanting to close with some class learnings from this experience. So I identify like 4 very clear barriers to students to reconnect with their creativity. So there was a misunderstanding about having this misunderstanding about creativity was really intimidating for them, which was similar to the prior class. So not knowing what creativity really was, not realizing that even if you are a computer science major, you can be creative. That creativity is not related with art, but is related to the ability to generate ideas as different as you can from what you are used to. That was a really big barrier for them. Their attitude, having this skeptical attitude about challenging themselves, usually was leading to little motivation and was a big barrier in really letting their imagination be and connecting with other ways of thinking. It seems like they needed to give themselves permission to think differently, to be able to think about wild ideas. It was like, I had to say, it's okay. We are asking you to be as wild as you can. So the permission was from us, the teachers, and also themselves. They have to give themselves permission. So this lack of permission was really hindering their ability to imagine. And the last one, it was this equating ideal to real. So every time they were thinking about ideal, they were thinking that it had to be something practical, doable, that they could actually make it happen tomorrow. And I try to make the distinction between ideas and solutions to help the students kind of break with that way of thinking, where ideas could be anything you want, and solution, you can start adding more constraints into the idea. So based on this, I have 6 recommendations to share with you. So the first one is like, I think the positive results of this class were possible because I really focused on the very first day to build trust with the students and a safe space. That also meant sharing my own experiences with them. So they started to feel comfortable to share things not only with each other, but also with me. And if there were things that they didn't understand, they were asking me. If there were things that from the exercises that they were not feeling comfortable with, they feel safe to share that with me as well. I also put a lot of emphasis in learning the science myself and then explain all the cognitive side, the internal mechanisms in the brain, why things were happening. So also they were asking a lot of why questions. So why is this important? Why brainstorming is so famous? Why divergent thinking? Why convergent thinking? So clarifying the concepts, explaining the science, and explaining the why behind all the different tools. So they could not only understand the tools, but also understand when to use the different tools. I put a lot of emphasis to develop a creative and playful mindset. So, but I also made the point like creativity can be fun, but creativity is hard work. You have to practice. It's like running a marathon. If you want to get to the end, you need to practice every day a little bit. And at the beginning, it's going to be harder because you're going to be doing things that you haven't done before, but you need to keep practicing and making it playful, making it fun, and makes it more enjoyable. So I try to bring that spirit every class to help them develop the mindset. I task them specifically with the activity of daydreaming for 3 straight days. And half of the students didn't even know what daydreaming meant or how to do it, because either they did it at some point in the past and then they were told that that was a waste of time, there's no point in doing that. So it was a really challenging activity that many students then wanted to repeat at the end of the semester because they found so much about from that. And I also asked them to practice self-reflection every week. So make that like an active task. Celebrate whatever the students are generating. So catch yourself when you are judging students' wild ideas, and rather than trying to be curious, trying to elaborate, ask them to elaborate on the idea, build on that, ask them to create a story, to add details, to make, if possible, a movie or I don't know, a complete book about each of their ideas. That helps also them feel excited and motivated about keep working on that. And also that helps them feel more confident about being different, about thinking about something that is very different from what other classes, for example, would expect them to do, or something that no one else has thought about. And the last one, encourage making ideas tangible in any way, form, or shape, either through materials. We tend to rely a lot on visual thinking and drawings, but sometimes you can also go with sounds, smells, role play, body language, I don't know, singing, anything that helps the students communicate somehow their ideas in a different way beyond only words. So some other people can interact with that, they can add things, and the idea can evolve and can grow. And just to close, I want to share with another quote from the student that she shared with me at the very end of the class. And she said, I often find myself living how others want me to live and choosing things that are the most logical, a mental block. It was this past semester, though, that I came to realize my own unhappiness and my desire to live for myself, not other people. I think it was a really powerful thought to close the talk today. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Sheila. It looks like we have some questions in the chat. Randy, you were the first to post your question. Would you like to rephrase it verbally, or should I just read it? I see
Go ahead.
Well, what Randy mentions that in the Philippines, they don't necessarily have an exact counterpart to the type of classes you're teaching, Sheila, but they do have something called cultural education. Perhaps you could share some of your learning design from your creativity course so that it could be adapted maybe to what Randy's up to. Randy, maybe you could elaborate.
What we have in the country are programs for teachers. So it's more of a trainer's training so that they can teach heritage and culture, but there's a creative component as well. So we'd like to adopt some of your best practices.
I think any of the recommendations, I don't think, let me rephrase, none of the recommendations are culturally specific. I think you could adapt any of those to the Philippines. If you don't have, for example, not many schools, I think, may have such an interactive classroom, but perhaps you can teach outdoors. I think there's a lot in nature you could adopt and bring into the classroom to help the students experience different things. So that could be something to think about. But I think any of the other ones, you can easily adapt them to the Philippines, if that was your question.
Thank you.
We have another question in the chat from Eugene. Thanks, Eugene. Do you have any idea about the different characteristics of the students, whether they be maybe psychological or background, like prior knowledge, expertise, characteristics of the students who were more ready and capable of the imagination activities? I hope I'm saying your question correctly, Eugene. You know, whether maybe on both sides, actually, I'm thinking the students who were most readily able to participate in the activities versus those that maybe had more trouble. Did you see any psychological attributes that might have differed, maybe goals, something like that?
No, at the very beginning, when I taught the first class, I thought my assumption was the students majoring in computer science and mechanical engineering are going to be more rigid than the ones wanting to major in music or dance. However, that was not the case. I had an excellent student that I think he was into physics or mathematics, and he just like completely reshaped his life after the class. So I really didn't see a pattern, but also I didn't dig into that as much. However, that's a great next step. You're muted, Dennis.
I was saying that would be our world in ed psych. That makes sense that you're asking that question, Eugene, as an ed psychologist. We want to know the psychological attributes that might predict creative education outcomes. Another question in the chat from Jan. Are you still in touch with any of these students? And did you have a chance to talk to them about midterm changes related to the course?
I am in touch with most of them. They usually drop me an email like every year or every half a year. To be honest, I think most of them have reverted to, they have more awareness about creativity or their potential, but they have reverted to the beginning of the class. Because I think you do need a follow-up, like at least keep being exposure to creative thinking, or someone that supports this way of thinking. For instance, has a very strong critical thinking orienting culture that is kind of hinders a little bit this way of thinking. And I'm not there anymore, so.
Yeah, you know, and it's like there's often fade out effects of educational interventions, not just in creativity, but you know, these effects, when we give an intervention, the effects don't last for people's entire life, just like mental health interventions, ed psych interventions don't necessarily last. Sinan, I see your hand is raised.
I first like to say that I'm quite moved by the course you designed, the exercises. I would have loved to take part in that course actually. And my question is, if you were to compare, I don't know if you've given a similar course to design students, but maybe you can imagine if you were to compare students who took design education to the students that you encountered in this course, are there any differences, or would you say that somewhat they're similar? Not in terms of, you know, making tangible products because they are used to that, but I'm more talking about the way they think and how easy it is for them to do these exercises.
It's a great question. So yes, I have been teaching creativity to design students and also to biologists, scientists. So I've been experimenting with different groups of students. And it's funny because the design students are not necessarily more creative. Actually, some of them have even more self-imposed constraints. As you said, they are very well versed with the techniques. So prototyping and drawing, they are very used to, but their idea generation techniques are not much more different from the non-design students, which to me was super interesting. They are perhaps more used to iterating or exploring or knowing that there's no only one right answer, but it's not like they have a wildly like different imagination. So that was interesting.
Another question in the chat from Kunyao. They're curious about this comment at the end of the presentation about the student that didn't want to live in a logical way. is there any worry about going too far that will steer students away from STEM education or something like that? So, Kunyao, I hope I understand your comment based on what you're saying. Please weigh in if I'm not getting it right.
I think it's not like I'm encouraging the students not to be computer scientists or not to be logical, if that's what they want to do. But my experience with Princeton students is most of them are in college because they had to be there, or they had to be engineers because that's what was expected from them. And half of them were not as happy as they could be. So I think in this case, she didn't want to be doing that. So it's not, if that's what you want to do and you're happy, go for it.
Another comment from Alice. This matches with her lived experience with teaching adult beginners. Performance. It sounds almost maybe like Alice, you're mentioning music performance or something, but I'd be curious to know what type of performance you're mentioning. Those with absolutely zero, actors performance, that makes sense. With absolutely zero experience could actually play more easily than those who had some experience. Alice, that's interesting lived experience. Would you want to elaborate maybe, if you want? No pressure, but.
Having a tech issue there for a second. Yeah, no, it really interesting talk, and you've just given me an idea for dealing with some things in a classroom I'm working in at the moment, actually. No, I spent about 10 years working with adult beginner actors, and it was really interesting that those who had done some amateur theatre or who had done more theatre at school, they would often come to the exercises, and they might be sort of braver at first, but often when you try to stretch them, they would start becoming quite formulaic. Whereas those who really had no experience at all, who were people, I remember one guy who was a builder and had been a builder since he was sort of 15 in the family business, and he would come out with the most just absolutely out there ideas. And it was really interesting to see how those of us trained in creative practices were still being taught to get it right. We were still being taught that there is a right and wrong, and actually in a way that was surprisingly restrictive. And it was really interesting to see that in action. So yeah, no, it's really interesting that you've seen something very similar in your work.
And I think it's also, I'm still trying to not do it, but I even catch myself like assuming things, so judging even either my own practice or the students, and I say no, because it's a learning. It's too ingrained from a societal point of view, this right and wrong view of the world, and we need to do this and what's expected from us. So that's why it has to start from us first, in order for the students to also learn, unlearn, and then see things differently. Yeah.
One comment that I missed in the chat. Sorry, Maria, for missing your text bubble. Could you share any of your experiences, Sheila, about assessment in the course? Like, for example, in my head, we want to think we're supporting the creativity of these students, but was there any data or any quantification that you went through in order to support that inference, or was it just your lived experience?
So usually I try to move with students from grade obsession, because I think this type of courses, I don't really care if they have an A, B, or C. That's not the point. The point is whether they have done the exercises or not. So I tended to grade like check, minus, check, plus. So, and the ones having a minus were those who didn't submit on time, didn't submit at all. The check were for the ones who just did the activity, but you can tell based on the reflective aspect, for example, that there was no much self-exploration, or they were not using any concepts from the class explicitly. So that's it, is done, but it's a check. And plus was those who really were trying to dig deeper into their own issues and trying to explore and experiment. But I didn't judge, for example, or assess the quality of the final output, whether it was better, worse, good, or bad, because it was such a personal type of class. I think no one got under an A in this class, because it was not the point. You had sometimes have to give a letter grade for institutional purposes, but was not the point of the class.
It'd be interesting one day to tie it to like a psychological intervention and do maybe a pre and post or something like that. What a cool opportunity. We have another raised hand to ask the question directly.
I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and I'm just curious as to whether or not the initial students that you tried to service that maybe dropped the course, if any of them came back, or if the information from the class was shared with any of them and they maybe came back to have a conversation with you or subsequently take the class.
So it's interesting. So I was teaching different courses at Princeton. So one was creativity, and then I had an information design course, and then I have a research course. So one of the students who dropped the creativity course then came to my information design class. And this was kind of a year and a half later or something like that. And he said, yeah, that class was too childish for me. I couldn't deal with that. It's like, to me, these students have very ingrained like judgments about what's right or wrong or what's expected from that type of education that they could not break with that. So it was the lack. So to me, learning creativity, you have to be in the right mindset, and it has to be your right moment. You can't force a student to engage in something if you are sensing a resistance from their side. And I just thought this student was not ready or whatever. I'm not a psychologist either, so I would love to partner with someone who could actually answer these questions. There's something internally that he was associating creativity equals play equals childish. This is not for me. I want to be a successful entrepreneur. But you try to explain, but then if the student is not receptive, there's only so much you can do.
Seems like some experience that matches yours, Sheila. Anna, before everyone else came in, we were talking about the Post-it notes.
Tell us about it, Sheila. What is your system there? We can't see it clearly.
I have been working for a long time on creativity research. So I was trying, to me, creativity has been a study from many silo perspectives, and there are not many people who actually cross this type of research. So psychologists look at this part, cognitive neuroscientists look at this part, designers perhaps look at this part. So I love crossing things. I integrate. My approach to everything is integrating different lines of work. So I was just trying to find every single author or researcher working on creativity from different perspectives and trying to map them and see where there are the similarities, where they are like thinking alike, and see what can be done. That's my ideal project, Anna, doing something from an integrated perspective.
And I was mentioning that there, I think one of the names, Dietrich, is a University of Georgia alumni. We can be proud of one of our Bulldogs up on your board. But also what an honor to be placed there in your thought bubble. Very cool. I joked, Anna, before you arrived that I have a new goal in life, to get on Sheila's board. So silly. Another question from Maria. Did you encounter any obstacles from stakeholders outside the classroom? That's a fascinating question, Maria. Thanks for posing it.
Actually, thanks for asking. I applied twice. So Princeton gives a really substantial grant to support innovative courses at Princeton. And I applied twice for this freshman seminar. And I was rejected twice because they told me there was not enough academic basis for such a course. I think that was sad to see, but I think that's the problem with creativity as well. Everyone wants to be innovative, but it's still challenging whether creativity is something you can learn, or is a subjective something, or is only something for artists. So yeah, hope I respond in your question.
Yeah. It's amazing your persistence in getting the course eventually approved. That's really important and really cool.
It's because when you see the change that it really makes in the students who went through the whole experience, it's amazing. And since then, that's why I've been trying to teach creativity as much as I can to different populations, because you see that that's the consistent result. Everyone, once they let their guard down and they start seeing the benefits, they change their lives. So with the science creativity class, I am in touch with the students because I'm trying to do a follow-up. They have been still practicing creativity. These are much older students because they are in their late 20s, so they are doing their PhD thesis. But they keep saying to me, it was before and after. So when you see those results, it's the motivation to keep teaching these classes.
Such a great way to end. I think we're coming in for a landing here. It's about noon. How about everyone just join me one more time in thanking Dr. Sheila Pontis for joining us at the Festival of Ideas.
Thank you.